Okay. So, yeah, hello everybody. Thanks for coming. Sorry I was gone last week. Well, I guess then the last session too was online as well. So, which hopefully that worked. It's on YouTube. You can go back and watch. Um, but yeah, so this is week 15 of biblical interpretations. As is tradition. My name is James. I'm a husband and a father, and I own an automotive business. Um, when this is working, I think it is. Okay. Yeah. So I have a degree in biblical and theological studies and ancient Near Eastern history, although I'm not an expert in anything. So we started this class back in October to discuss a specific epistemological and hermeneutic framework um, that I've been developing kind of over the course of my life. We spent 8 weeks building a foundational paradigm so that I could say the following sentence and hope that it makes sense. So, the revelation of God is inherently contradictory. The biblical text describes a God defined beyond all knowledge that also wants to be known. The moment the knowledge of God transcends the boundary between what is not known becomes part of what is known, that God no longer is transcendent, but rather is continuous and becomes defined by what is known. And so this is the fundamental concern of the biblical text. How can humanity know God without God being entirely defined by all that is known? This is the fundamental issue we are seeking an answer to. Another way to think of it is how God can be known as this without becoming known as something like this. Um, and so here is our completed map so far. We've now read about we have read about 5 generations of this family, starting from Terah. Last session, we had begun a really important thread that started in Genesis 14 with the hospitality paradigm of Melchizedek towards Abraham in the city of Salem. We then read Genesis 18, and we see the hospitality paradigm between Abraham and the messengers of God. Then we read Genesis 19 and the hospitality paradigm of Lot in the city of Sodom towards the same messengers of God. And then we read Genesis 33, where a few generations later, Jacob and the 11 sons of Israel, upon re entering into the land of Canaan, after meeting Esau in the Yavak Canyon, they arrive at the city of Shechem. So the arrival at Shechem is a marker, signifying to Jacob and the sons of Israel that the God of Abraham has brought them into this land, just as the God of Abraham brought Abraham to the same place. But unlike in past generations, where Shechem becomes a point of affirmation of the knowledge of God, this time Shechem becomes a place of defilement, like with Sodom and Gomorrah. When we see the hospitality standard of Shechem with the rape of Jacob's daughter Dinah. We then read in Genesis 35, and we see this family leave Shechem and they go south to Bethel. But before leaving, they bury the idols at Shechem, the idols that I believe were from Terah. At Bethel, we see this like closing parentheses of a story that began in Genesis 28 when Jacob fled from Esau. We then read about Rachel, who dies while giving birth to Benjamin, the only son of Jacob to be born in the land of Canaan and not in Haran. When Rachel is buried on the way to Bethlehem. Then Jacob and the 12 sons of Israel, they arrive in Hebron to meet the patriarch Isaac. Upon arriving, Isaac dies and he is buried in the same location as Sarah, Abraham, Rebekah, and Isaac. And so 5 generations total so far. 2 generations, Terah and Abram, are born in Ur. 2 generations, Isaac and Benjamin, are born in Canaan. 1 generation, the 11 sons of Jacob, are all born in Haran. 1 generation, Terah dies in Haran. 2 generations, Abraham, Isaac, die and are buried in Canaan. 1 generation, or Isaac, is born, lives in, and dies entirely in Canaan. So everybody else has come and gone, and every time they enter and every time they leave, they stop at Shechem. So now we come to Genesis 36. And overall, we're going to skip Genesis 36 for now. So we might come back to it at some point, but I don't know. There's good information in Genesis 36, but it is not information that, it's information that follows paradigms we've already discussed. And the information isn't immediately pertinent in order to keep our journey going. But in short, to just kind of summarize Genesis 36, it tells us 2 important things. We read Genesis 36, verse 6. It says, "Then Esau took his wives, his sons, his daughters, and all the members of his household, his livestock, all his beasts, and all his property that he had acquired in the land of Canaan. He went into a land away from his brother Jacob, for their possessions were too great for them to dwell together. The land of the sojournings could not support them because of their livestock. So Esau settled in the hill country of Seir." Esau is Edom. So if these verses seem familiar, it's because it is. And it is yet again another example of a type of generational repetition that hopefully by now we're more familiar with. Genesis 36 is a reflection of Genesis 13, when Abram and Lot experienced the same thing. When they come into the land and realize that it cannot support them both, and so they split ways. So Isaac is a generational repetition of Abram, and Esau is a generational repetition of Lot. We already have these paths mapped, and so we don't need to map it again because it's the same journey. From here, the rest of Genesis 36 is a genealogy of the Edomites from Esau, which is the point of Genesis 36, to establish where Edom came from, that being from Esau. So there's some interesting information in Genesis 36, but like I said, we're just going to kind of skip over it for now. So now we come to Genesis 37, and we read. Jacob lived in the land of his father's sojournings, in the land of Canaan. These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his sons, because he was the son of his old age. And he made him a robe of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all of his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Hear this dream that I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright. And behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." His brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Or are you indeed to rule over us?" So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Then he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers and said, "Behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you?" And his brothers were jealous of him. But his father kept the saying in mind. Now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them." And he said to him, "Here I am." So Jacob said to Joseph, "Go now, see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring me word." So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. And a man found him wandering in the fields. And the man asked him, "What are you seeking?" "I am seeking my brothers," he said. "Tell me, please, where they are pasturing the flock." And the man said, "They have gone away, for I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. And so we read, these are the generations of Jacob. Except the text doesn't go into a lengthy genealogy like we would expect. Instead, it starts to tell this story. And so the first story about the fifth generation begins. And we find Joseph as a 17-year-old boy. He is shepherding in the lands of his father Jacob's sojournings. And he tells his father everything evil that his brothers do. The Hebrew here is the idea of a report. He reports on what his brothers do. He makes like spreadsheets and he like presents data. It's just like, look at all the things they're doing wrong. Um, his brothers hate him and cannot speak peace unto him. The word there for peace is shalom. His brothers cannot grant him shalom. So then Joseph has a dream. And what does he do? He speaks. He tells the dream to his brothers. He's all like, "I'm to be sovereign over you." And they hate him for his dream and for his words, it says. And then he has another dream. And he tells this dream to his brothers again. And it's like he's rubbing it in their faces. But then he tells the second dream to his father, too. And it's interesting because Joseph's mother is already dead. And yet in the dream, even she is to bow to Joseph, something that Jacob seems to make note of in this. Jacob is the patriarch, not Joseph. Joseph is the youngest person in this family. This is backwards. And the brothers hate him for it. And Jacob seems perplexed, but ponders Jacob's words. After this, his brothers go to Shechem to pasture the flock. And so, looking at our map, they go from Hebron up the ridge route to Shechem. They're probably supposed to go to the same land that Jacob had purchased previously when they had arrived in Shechem after they had returned from Haran, before the rape of Dinah. So the sons of Israel are supposed to go there to pasture the flock. Jacob says to Joseph, "Are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them." And Joseph says, "Here I am." So Jacob says to him, "Go now, see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring me word." This Hebrew word for the word word is the same word I said earlier is more like a report. In other words, Jacob is using Joseph to spy on his brothers. It's as if Jacob knows they aren't where they are supposed to be. So Joseph goes from the valley of Hebron up the ridge route and comes to Shechem. And when he arrives, he probably arrives at the field Jacob had purchased, and he can't find his brothers. And a man tells Joseph, they're not here, they went to Dothan. So we want to draw a green line on our maps, starting at Shechem. If you look at Shechem, and you look northwest, it's like an inch, an inch northwest of Shechem. You'll see the city of Dothan. So we can trace the route in green, just following the road. We're not going to circle Dothan, but we can underline it. So it's this. Oh, right here. It's Dotham. It's right here.
Oh, you said west. East.
Northwest. Found it. You got it. Good
You're in
job.
the wrong direction.
Chuck,
Yeah.
how's that spelled?
You said we're not gonna?
Schekem or Chem.
Okay, so it starts with an S. It's just that the green is a little heavy on there, it's hard to see.
Oh yeah.
It
Yeah,
starts
I
with
would
an S.
I would put a big circle around that just because it's we constantly
Around Dothan?
around Shechem. That's just
Oh,
about
yeah.
on their map.
It was Dothan, you don't read.
You just underline it, but it's not a point of emphasis because again they're not supposed to be there. So when we find Dothan and you look at it on your map, you'll see that it's pretty close to the International Coastal Highway. There's a road just north of it that connects the city of Jezreel to Gath, like this. If you see here, that is one of 3 branches of the International Coastal Highway that comes out of the Jezreel Valley. Geographically, it's really, really obvious how it works. But the point being, the point being that Dothan is pretty close to the International Coastal Highway.
Why does that matter?
Yeah. So from Dothan, from this perspective, we're going to keep reading now, okay? And that'll answer that question. So Genesis 37:18, and so it says, the brothers, saw him, Joseph, from afar. And before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. They said to one another, here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams. But when Reuben heard it, he rescued him out of their hands, saying, let us not take his life. And Reuben said to them, shed no blood. Throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand to restore him to his father. Reuben is the oldest, the firstborn son of Jacob. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped Joseph of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore, and they took him and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty, there was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat. And looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, with their camels bearing gum, balm, and myrrh, on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, what profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh. And his brothers listened to him. Then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. They took Joseph to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes and returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone, and where shall I go?" Then they took Joseph's robe and slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in the blood. And they sent the robe of many colors and brought it to their father and said, "This we have found. Please identify whether it is your son's robe or not." And he identified it and said, "It's my son's robe. A fierce animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him. But he refused to be comforted and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning." Thus his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. So, a couple of thoughts on this. One, it seems to me that Jacob knew his sons were not doing what they were supposed to be doing, that being pasturing the flock in Shechem. So he sends Joseph to report on his brothers. I wonder if Jacob was still trying to make use of Shechem, even after Shechem raped Dinah. And the sons had their revenge on Shechem in response to the rape of their sister. I wonder if Jacob was intending on trying to continue jurisdiction relationships with Shechem and surrounding villages and cities. And I wonder if the brothers had absolutely no intention on returning to Shechem after the rape of Dinah. So perhaps they don't go to Shechem and they go to Dothan when Jacob tells them to go to Shechem for the same reason they killed Shechem in response to the rape of Dinah when Jacob was trying to maintain peace with the king of Shechem. You know, it's primarily a city, but in the story of the rape of Dinah, her rapist is named Shechem. So, no, not in this story. So it kind of gets, but in general, it's the city, but in the one story, there's a person named Shechem. Yeah. So yeah, two, it seems to me in reading this, that the brothers anticipated that Joseph would come. Three, the brothers conspire to kill Joseph and throw him into a pit. So now, in the text, when it says pit, what it means is cistern. So a cistern is a sort of cave, usually made by hand, to store water. So like this. So this is a picture of a water cistern in Jerusalem. This specific cistern is from around the First Temple period. So basically, think of a cistern like a well, except cisterns don't have spring water. So a cistern, you have to fill it up with water manually, or you could use aqueducts or channel rain runoff through the top to fill it up with water in the rainy season. No. Yeah, that's a person. So I don't know. It's 12 feet. They're all different sizes. In the Second Temple period, Herod the Great, there's cisterns that Herod the Great had that are millions of gallons of water, like massive. This one is from the First Temple period. This one is small compared to the ones that the Romans made. Anyways, that's a different conversation. But yeah, but it's a cistern, so they throw him into a cistern like this. So it's not just like a hole in the ground, So Reuben, Reuben, who is the firstborn son, also known as, he's next in line to be the head patriarch. He convinces his brothers to not murder Joseph, and instead puts Joseph in a cistern alive with the intention to come get him later to bring him back to Jacob. And again, this seems to be pulling from these themes we have seen elsewhere regarding the placement of murder on the moral hierarchy relative to position of power and sovereignty. Later on, when Reuben responds to Joseph missing, he says, "The boy is gone, where shall I go?" This is a reflection of the moral responsibility he had for his siblings, being the firstborn son. In the context of Jacob's sovereignty, Reuben has failed the burden to protect the family and to protect Joseph, even from themselves. I'm not sure. Wait. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So point 5. So after they put Joseph in the cistern, it says the cistern was empty, there was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat. So it could be that this was a broken cistern that was cracked and couldn't contain water. Or this gives us a clue to the time of year this story takes place, that being very late into a dry summer, because there's no water. It's also interesting when you just think about things we've talked about in the past, just geographically, Canaan requires cisterns because there's no rivers. So it's very reliant on rain. Okay, so point 6. I think the phrase "they sat down to eat" is reflective of the same hospitality matters that we've seen in other stories. So the carelessness towards Joseph that his brothers had in sticking him in a hole to then sit down and eat is on par with Sodom's level of hospitality towards the messengers that Lot and Abraham offered food and shelter to. So I think that that's trying to, again, really speak to the atrociousness of the behavior of these brothers. 7, they sit down to eat and they see a caravan coming down the international coastal highway. So the caravan is of Ishmaelites on their way to Egypt. Judah has the great idea of selling Joseph to the Ishmaelites. And remember, the Ishmaelites are people who would be their cousins a few times removed. Ultimately, Ishmaelites are descendants of Abraham as well. And we've talked about that in past classes. The text then says, "Then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph out of the cistern and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver and took Joseph to Egypt." This is interesting because it doesn't make it very clear who sold Joseph to who. The easiest explanation is both the Ishmaelites and the Midianites are descendants of Abraham and thus are part of the same nation of nations. I would encourage you could Google this verse and try to read about it, especially within different Jewish commentaries, because it's really interesting. There's a lot of different discussion as to who actually sold Joseph. Anyways, point 8. So it's interesting to me that Judah is the one who has the idea to sell Joseph. And his rationale is, what profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? We can't kill him because he is our own flesh. So I find this interesting as it comes across like they did not intend on following Reuben's orders to not kill Joseph. In other words, the brothers were not listening to Reuben, the firstborn oldest son, who's supposed to be in charge. So Joseph says, let's sell him instead. And the text explicitly says they listened to Judah. And so again, we see an issue here regarding the authority of the would-be patriarch. They don't listen to him. It is clear that Reuben is not in the loop regarding the other brothers' intentions and what to do about Joseph. It is also interesting to me because Judah's rationale is because he is their flesh and blood. To me, this idea has a similar rationale to the brothers' responses as to why they killed and plundered Shechem after the rape of Dinah, because Dinah was their sister, their flesh and blood. It's also interesting because some scholars suggest that it emphasizes Judah saying we can't kill him because he's our flesh and blood is reflective of the fact that the other brothers were not perceiving Joseph as his brother because he was born of a different mother. Which again, all of these things are just speaking to the tumultuous relationships within this family that all seem to happen after the rape of Dinah. Okay, so point 9. Then the text says they took Joseph to Egypt. And again, so far in the whole story we've been reading, there's no examples where going to Egypt is the byproduct of something good. It's always due to something bad. 10. Jacob, upon learning of the death of Joseph, tears his clothes and mourns. It then says, all his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, no, I should go down to Sheol to my son mourning. Thus his father wept for him. This word, Sheol, is the Hebrew word that 1,500 years later gets translated into the Greek word Hades, which is where we get our modern idea of the underworld, or hell. However, in this story of Jacob, the word here is reflecting the idea of grave, or beneath the earth or the ground, which is its original usage. So this phrase, I should go down to Sheol to my son mourning, is Jacob saying, as my son is dead beneath the ground, I shall mourn until I too am beneath the ground. In Hebrew, everybody eventually ends up in Sheol. Everybody eventually ends up in the ground. And then finally, point of 11, we see the Midianites sold Joseph to Potiphar in Egypt. And Potiphar is the captain of Pharaoh's guard. And so now we're back in Egypt, which we've tried to avoid. You can do this if you want. So if we take a green marker and we start in Dothan, where we just were, we want to trace a green line following the International Coastal Highway south like this. So you can go from Dothan out to the highway all the way down to Egypt. So, and as far as I can tell, this is probably the first time in the text where it's pretty safe to say with absolute certainty that anybody of this family traveled the International Coastal Highway. Almost all the traveling we've seen so far has been on the Ridge Route or through the Negev. Okay, point 12. So now we have Joseph in Egypt. We have Jacob in Hebron, and the sons of Israel are in Dothan. This family could not possibly be more divided and split amongst each other. So now we move on to Genesis 38. But before we do, I want to highlight a few things that we've read in the past. So in the story of the rape of Dinah, We read a few weeks ago, Genesis 34:25. It says, on the third day, when they were sore, two of the sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, took their swords and came against the city Shechem while it felt secure and killed all the males. Then Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, you have brought trouble on me by making me stink to the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites and the Perizzites. My numbers are few, and if they gather themselves against me and attack me, I shall be destroyed, both I and my household. But they said, should he treat our sister like a prostitute? So take note, Simeon and Levi are the second and third born. And the text has them directly in defiance of Jacob's intentions in dealing with the rape of Dinah. So then, last week, we read Genesis 35, verse 22. It says, while Israel lived in that land, Reuben went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard of it. Now the sons of Jacob were 12. And that's all the text says about this incident. And it seems a very significant thing to just skim over. And if you blank, you just miss it altogether. I read this last week, and you may not even have noticed that it was in the text. And so we see this verse where the oldest son of Jacob lays with his father's concubine, Bilhah, who is also the mother of the brothers Dan and Naphtali. And so this is an interesting passage that has some interesting things we could discuss, but we don't have time to go into those details in full right now. But the point is this. As with Simeon and Levi, we now have the oldest son doing something in direct defiance of the patriarch's sovereign authority. So all three of the firstborn sons, Reuben, Simeon, and Levi, all have issues with Jacob. It's tumultuous. Maybe Reuben isn't fit to be firstborn. And maybe Simeon and Levi can't replace him either. Who's next in line? So the fourth born is Judah. So let's continue our story of Joseph. And so we read in Genesis 38. It happened at that time that Judah went down from his brothers and turned aside to a certain Adullamite, whose name was Hira. There Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua. He took her and went into her, and she conceived and bore a son, and he called his name She conceived again and bore a son, and she called his name Onan. Yet again she bore a son, and she called his name Shelah. Judah was in Chezib when she bore him. And Judah took his wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her, and raise up offspring for your brother. But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, so whenever he went into his brother's wife, he would waste the semen on the ground so as not to give offspring to his brother. And what he did was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also. Then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, remain a widow in your father's house till Shelah, my son, grows up, for he feared that he would die like his brothers. So Tamar went and remained in her father's house. In the course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died. When Judah was comforted, he went up to Timnah to his sheep shearers, he and his friend Hira the Adullamite. And when Tamar was told, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep, she took off her widow's garments and covered herself with a veil, wrapping herself up, and sat at the entrance of En-Naim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah was grown up, and she had not been given to him in marriage. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. He turned to her at the roadside and said, "Come, let me come into you," for he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. She said, "What will you give me that you may come to me?" He answered, "I will send you a young goat from the flock." And she said, "If you give me a pledge until you send it." He said, "What pledge shall I give you?" She replied, "Your signet and your cord and your staff that is in your hand." So he gave them to her and went into her, and she conceived by him. Then she arose and went away, and taking off her veil, she put on the garments of her widowhood. When Judah sent to the young goat by his friend the Adullamite to take back the pledge from the woman's hand, he did not find her. And he asked the men of the place, "Where is the cult prostitute who was at Enaim at the roadside?" And they said, "No cult prostitute has been here." So he returned to Judah and said, "I have not found her." Also the men of the place said, "No cult prostitute has been here." And Judah replied, "Let her keep the things as her own, or we shall be laughed at. You see, I sent this young goat, and you did not find her." About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has been immoral. Moreover, she is pregnant by immorality." And Judah said, "Bring her out and let her be burned." As she was being brought out, she sent word to her father-in-law, "By the man to whom these belong, I am pregnant." And she said, "Please identify whose these are, the signet and the cord and the staff." Then Judah identified them and said, "She is more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah." And he did not know her again. When the time of her labor came, there were twins in her womb. And when she was in labor, one put out a hand, and the midwife took and tied a scarlet thread on his hand, saying, "This one came out first." But as he drew back his hand, behold, his brother came out, and she said, "What a breach you have made for yourself." Therefore his name was called Perez. Afterward his brother came out and with the scarlet thread on his hand, and his name was called Zerah. Okay, when we read Genesis 37, it ends with Joseph being sold to Potiphar. And if we start reading Genesis 39 right now, it begins with an introduction of Joseph and Potiphar. And yet, in between Genesis 37 and Genesis 39, the story of Joseph gets interrupted, and we get this bizarre story about Judah and Tamar. It seems very strange and very out of place, like it's inserted into the middle of the story. Some scholars think this story of Judah and Tamar was not supposed to be here and was added in after the fact. Some say it has no bearing on the story of Joseph. I personally disagree. I think this story about Judah has a lot to do with the story of Joseph. And again, when we see patterns and interruptions, it can be interpreted as a point of emphasis, like there is a greater equation developing. But you need to resolve small equations inside of multiple sets of parentheses first. So what is the story of Judah and Tamar about? So a couple of thoughts. One, it opens with Judah went down from his brothers. So he goes to visit a friend named Hera who lives in the city of Adullam. Why? One theory within Jewish thought is that Judah left his brothers to try to follow the caravan that Joseph was sold to. Perhaps Judah, in suggesting the brothers sell Joseph, thought he was going to save Joseph. Like how Reuben argued to save Joseph's life by putting him in the cistern with the intention of coming back later to get him, perhaps Judah thought if he could get Joseph removed from the region of the brothers by selling him to the Ishmaelites, maybe he could then catch up to them and get Joseph back. So he leaves his brothers and he heads south down the International Coastal Highway. So on our map, if we follow the route from Dothan down the coastal highway, it would seem likely that Judah gets to around the city of Ashdod, and he gives up on the pursuit of his brother Joseph. And from Ashdod, if we head east up the road, you'll see Timnah, You'll see this, it's called the Sorek Valley. And then we see the city of Adullam. And Judah reaches Adullam and he stops. So this would be, this is the route here. Oh, how did that get all messed up? Well, I'll have to fix that.
Here's Ashdod.
Yep, Ashdod. You come up here. You see Timnah, and then you come up to Sorek Valley. You follow this road here, and you see Adullam right here.
And that was what was this one again?
That's where Judah goes.
This is the one where he goes.
Yeah. So we're up here in Dothan. He comes down this road. He kind of probably gets around here to Ashdod. Basically comes this way. You see Timnah here. And if you keep on this road here, keep following this, and it ends at here. So he ends up right there.
I think I got it.
You find it?
It started here and it's over here.
Yeah.
And what did he do in Ashdod again? That's where he.
I haven't read that far yet.
Oh, sorry.
Well, no, actually, I guess we did read it. So that's where he meets the Canaanite. He meets a Canaanite woman. He marries her. He has 3 sons. Okay, so there's Adullam on our maps. You can underline that in green if you want. Again, it's not a place we emphasize as it doesn't really come up much, but it is within the region of the sojourns that we've discussed a lot. So another theory involving this segment of Judah, perhaps he was on his way back to Hebron. So after the story of Joseph, maybe Judah heads south to go to Hebron. And he simply just cannot stomach the idea of seeing his father so heartbroken and beat up about Joseph. So Judah stops in Adullam. Both these ideas that he was in pursuit of Joseph and trying to go back to Hebron, both those ideas can be true at the same time. But the point being, it could be that Genesis 38 is expressing some sense of the reaction Judah had to his own actions regarding his treatment of Joseph. And maybe that is why it interrupts the story of Joseph. 2, Joseph then marries the unnamed daughter of a Canaanite named Shua. So we've established for multiple generations now, this family is not supposed to marry Canaanites, but Judah does. And he has 3 sons. And so let's think about this. How many years does Judah avoid Jacob? How long did Judah remain in the hill country, refusing to head south to see his father in Hebron? It is uncertain for sure, but it's reasonably somewhere between 3 to 10 years. It's as if Judah is trying to forget. It's as if he is trying to assimilate into the Canaanites. Maybe his intention is to leave his family behind outright, due to the guilt of what he did to Joseph. 3, Judah has 3 sons, Onah, and Shelah. Judah finds a wife for his oldest son, The wife's name is mentioned. Her name is Tamar. And then is wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord puts him to death. And the text gives no explanation as to why. But upon the death of the oldest son, it then becomes the job of the second oldest son, Onah, to raise an offspring with Tamar on behalf of the deceased brother. Onah refuses to do this, which is something you're not supposed to refuse to do. His refusal to do this makes him wicked too, and so he dies as well. So then it would become the responsibility of the next oldest son to raise offspring for the oldest son. So the firstborn dies, then the secondborn Onah dies. So the youngest son Shelah is up next. Judah is probably thinking, everybody that has a duty to impregnate Tamar ends up dead. So let's just kick the can down the road, and I'll tell Tamar to wait until Shelah is old enough to marry. So some rabbis have suggested that the wickedness of the brothers are the same, a refusal to impregnate Tamar. So in an attempt to save his youngest, Judah's only remaining son, Judah prevents the marriage. Eventually, Judah's wife, Shua, dies. And by now, the youngest son, Shelah, should have married Tamar. But Judah has neglected his patriarchal duty. So Tamar takes matters into her own hands and tricks Judah. And I'm not going to lie, there's elements to this story that reminds me a lot of Jacob, Laban, Rachel, and Leah. Something I think is interesting. It says when Tamar disguised herself as a prostitute, she covered her face so Judah would not recognize her. There's an interesting commentary in Jewish tradition in which Tamar normally covered her face as this would be the tradition. In other words, if her face was covered with a head cover, Judah would recognize her. But prostitutes did not cover their faces. So actually, Tamar uncovers her face, and in doing so, Judah does not recognize her. So it's like she covers her face with her face by uncovering her face with her face covering. It's just interesting. Some Jewish tradition parallels Genesis 37:32, where the brothers bring Joseph's tunic to Jacob for identification, as a mirror to Genesis 38:25, when Tamar brings pieces of Judah's clothing to Judah for identification. So ultimately, the point is this: as we will see in later passages of Genesis, we see Reuben, Simeon, and Levi sabotage their relationship with Jacob by forsaking their patriarchal duty and submitting to their father's authority. Judah, being the next son up, is on the verge of doing the same in his actions towards Joseph. And as a consequence, we see the three sons of Judah suffer the same sort of patriarchal fate as Judah's oldest brothers. And so Tamar's righteousness becomes a sort of reflection back to Judah on himself. And this section climaxes with Judah saying, "She is more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah, and he did not know her again." It is the opinion of Jewish tradition that intermingled to the story of Joseph is the story about redemption of Judah. That the realization that Tamar was the only person righteous in their midst is what transforms and redeems Judah for being a son who submits the authority of his elder brothers to becoming a son who would protect his brothers, as is the expectation of the patriarch. So now from here we keep reading, and we will skip Genesis 39 for now, which is a story yet again involving Joseph's tunic that gets Joseph thrown in prison by his master in Egypt. We'll also skip over Genesis 40 for now, which is a story yet again about Joseph's dreams. And we will read Genesis 41. So, Genesis 41. After 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile. And behold, there came up out of the Nile 7 cows, attractive and plump, and they fed in the reed grass. And behold, 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile after them, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. And the ugly, thin cows ate up the 7 attractive, plump cows. And Pharaoh awoke, and he fell asleep and dreamed a second time. And behold, 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk. And behold, after them sprouted 7 ears, thin and blighted by the east wind. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump, full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. So in the morning his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my offenses today when Pharaoh was angry with his servant and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard. We dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own interpretation. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. When he told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And as he interpreted to us, so it came about. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph answered Pharaoh, It is not me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, Behold, in my dream I was standing on the banks of the Nile. 7 cows, plump and attractive, came up out of the Nile and fed in the reed grass. 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and thin, such as I have never seen in all the land of Egypt. And the thin, ugly cows ate up the first 7 plump cows. But when they had eaten them, no one would have known that they had eaten them, for they were still as ugly as at the beginning. Then I awoke. I also saw in my dream 7 ears growing on one stalk, full and good, 7 ears withered and thin and blighted by the east wind, sprouted after them, and the thin ears swallowed up the 7 good ears. And I told it to my magicians, and there was no one who could explain it to me. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, The dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty ears blighted by the east wind are also 7 years of famine. It is as I told Pharaoh. God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout the land of Egypt, but after them there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land, and the plenty will be unknown in the land by reason of the famine that will follow, for it will be very severe. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. Now therefore let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land, and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming, and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food of the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be in reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine. This proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants, and Pharaoh said to his servants, Can we find a man like this, in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, Since God has shown you all of this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, See, I have set you over the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him ride in his 2nd chariot. And they called out before him, Bow the knee. Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no one shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphenath-Paneah, and he gave him in marriage Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. So Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. During the 7 plentiful years, the earth produced abundantly, and he gathered up all the food of these 7 years, which occurred in the land of Egypt, and put the food in the cities. He put in every city the food from the fields around it. And Joseph stored up grain in great abundance like the sand of the sea until he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured. Before the year of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bore them to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for he said, God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. The name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. The 7 years of plenty that occurred in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come. As Joseph has said, there was famine in all the lands, but in the land of Egypt there was bread. And all the land of Egypt was famished. The people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, go to Joseph, what he says you do. So when the famine had spread all over the land, Joseph opened up the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the earth came to Egypt to Joseph to buy grain, because the famine was severe over all the earth. And so Joseph is in Egypt, but there's a problem, and a big problem, because for generations now, this family fights to be in Canaan, the land of famines. Egypt is not supposed to have famines. When Canaan has famines, you go to Egypt, because Egypt floods. The Nile floods like clockwork. What do you do if Egypt has no flood? What do you do if Egypt has no food? Egypt is not supposed to famine. Joseph is done with Canaan. He becomes Egyptian. When it says he shaves and is brought before Pharaoh, this is very indicative of what an Egyptian would do. Joseph assimilates. He becomes Egyptian. Joseph is done with his Canaanite family. He literally names his oldest son Manasseh, which means to forget. For he forgot about all the hardships of his father's house. Joseph was done with Canaan, the hardships of Canaan, the hardships of each generation not upholding their patriarchal duty to protect the family. He names his second-born Ephraim, which means to be fruitful, because God made Joseph fruitful in his affliction. Pharaoh makes Joseph second in command, and as Joseph's story begins with a tunic of color, his redemption from the pit concludes with Pharaoh, God himself, putting a fine tunic on Joseph. And Joseph becomes the savior of the world and providing bread during the famine. It's the ultimate rags to riches story, the ultimate American dream. The story of Joseph to me is one of the best stories humanity has ever conceived. And we're done for tonight. So we will pick up the rest of this next week. And we're almost done with Genesis. Once we're done with Genesis, I do not intend to be going through things the way we are. We're going to shift back to very conceptual ideas. We will not be reading nearly as much of the text. At least, yeah. So we're getting somewhere, and we're getting close. So thanks for coming tonight, everybody. Good to see everyone. I'm sorry, say again? Not yet. Sorry. I'm just ending on this slide because once we get to this, when we get to Mount Sinai is when we're going to talk about this. Because this starts a discussion that to me is what it's what everything we're doing is working towards. But it won't make sense. It won't make as much sense prior to Mount Sinai. So, anyways, I've just been using this just to end on because when we discuss it, it'll make sense. So, anyways, yeah. So, thanks everyone.